The hallowed halls of the United States House of Representatives frequently serve as the primary crucible where the most fundamental disagreements regarding the nature of the American experiment are forged into the public record. Within this particular session, an atmosphere of palpable tension began to coalesce as Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took her position at the podium to address the assembled body and the nation beyond. Her presence often acts as a catalyst for deep-seated ideological debates that transcend the immediate legislative matters at hand on any given afternoon in Washington. She initiated a line of questioning that sought to probe the very heart of the social contract as understood by the modern progressive movement in the 21st century. The Congresswoman from New York posited a query that challenged the conventional criticisms of federal involvement by asking when exactly citizens find cause to lament the state providing too much support for their well-being. This rhetorical inquiry was not merely a simple question, but rather a calculated strike at the foundational premises of small government advocacy that have dominated American political thought for decades. By framing the government as a provider of essential services rather than a bureaucratic burden, she effectively shifted the burden of proof onto her ideological opponents. The silence that followed her opening remarks was less a vacuum and more a pressurized space where the competing visions of the American future were being weighed against one another. She suggested that the historical narrative of the overbearing state is often disconnected from the lived realities of constituents who rely on federal programs for their daily survival. This perspective asserts that the collective power of the community, channeled through the state, is the only force capable of checking the unbridled influence of private interests. As the Congresswoman continued her discourse, she emphasized the positive outcomes of public investment that often go unremarked upon in the heat of partisan warfare. Her argument rested on the premise that the vast majority of citizens are more concerned with the quality of their healthcare and education than with the abstract theories of federalism. This approach seeks to humanize the administrative state by focusing on the tangible benefits it provides to the working class and the marginalized. It represents a bold defense of the public sector at a time when skepticism toward institutional authority has reached a fever pitch across the political spectrum. Her words were carefully chosen to resonate with a generation that views the government as a potential shield against economic precarity and social injustice. The reaction from the other side of the aisle was immediate and reflected a deep-seated philosophical resistance to the expansion of the federal apparatus. This confrontation was not just about the specific policies being debated, but about the underlying values that define the American character and its relationship to power. While one side viewed the state as a benevolent force for equity, the other saw it as a looming shadow over the liberties of the individual. This tension is the defining characteristic of the modern legislative process, where every word spoken on the floor is a volley in a much larger cultural and economic struggle. The dialogue captures a moment in time where the traditional consensus on the role of government is being radically re-examined by all participants. Representative Chip Roy, a vocal advocate for constitutional originalism and fiscal restraint, did not allow the Congresswoman's assertion to stand unchallenged for long. He stood to offer a rebuttal that was as sharp in its delivery as it was comprehensive in its scope and historical grounding. His response was rooted in the belief that the growth of the federal government is inversely proportional to the preservation of individual freedom and local autonomy. He argued that the very services the Congresswoman praised are often the vehicles through which the state exerts an intrusive influence over the lives of ordinary people. To him, the question was not about the intent of the government, but about the inevitable consequences of centralized power and the erosion of self-reliance. The debate then shifted into a granular examination of how federal agencies interact with the average American on a day-to-day basis. Roy contended that the bureaucracies in Washington have become increasingly detached from the concerns and the common sense of the people they meant to serve. He painted a picture of a weaponized administrative state that uses its regulatory power to punish political dissent and enforce a singular cultural orthodoxy. This view posits that the expansion of government services is a Trojan horse for the permanent establishment of a ruling class that is unaccountable to the electorate. It is a perspective that resonates deeply with a segment of the population that feels increasingly alienated from the centers of power in their own country. The discourse between these two figures highlights the extreme polarization that currently defines the American political landscape and the legislative process itself. Each representative serves as a surrogate for a much larger constituency that holds diametrically opposed views on the nature of justice and the purpose of the law. Their exchange was a rare moment of direct intellectual combat, where the polite veneers of parliamentary procedure were stripped away to reveal the raw ideologies underneath. It was a confrontation that was both deeply personal and intensely symbolic of the broader fractures within the national body politic. The arguments presented were not merely for the benefit of those in the room, but were intended to mobilize their respective bases across the country. One of the central themes of the rebuttal was the issue of the national debt and the long-term sustainability of the current fiscal trajectory. Roy argued that the excessive spending required to maintain a sprawling federal government is a form of generational theft that burdens future Americans with insurmountable obligations. He linked the expansion of government programs directly to the devaluation of the currency and the rising cost of living for middle-class families. This economic critique serves as a cornerstone of the conservative argument against the progressive vision of an ever-expanding social safety net. It frames the debate as a choice between immediate gratification through public spending and the long-term stability of the American economy and its global standing. The mention of border insecurity served as a potent example of what Roy described as the federal government's failure to perform its most basic and essential functions. He argued that while the state is busy interfering in the private lives of its citizens, it is simultaneously failing to protect the physical integrity of the nation's boundaries. This perceived incompetence is cited as a primary reason why many Americans have lost faith in the ability of Washington to manage even the simplest of tasks. It highlights a paradox where the government is seen as being both too powerful in its regulatory reach and too weak in its core responsibilities. This duality is a recurring theme in the critique of the modern administrative state and its perceived misplaced priorities. The clash also touched upon the concept of weaponized bureaucracies, which has become a focal point of contemporary conservative concern and political messaging. Roy expressed a deep suspicion of the various federal agencies that he believes have been captured by partisan interests and used as tools of domestic surveillance. This argument suggests that the growth of the state has led to the creation of a permanent class of unelected officials who hold more power than the people's representatives. It is a direct challenge to the progressive idea that professional expertise within the civil service is a necessary component of a functional modern democracy. The debate thus becomes a question of who truly governs and to whom those in power are ultimately responsible. As the exchange intensified, the contrast between the two speakers became a visual and auditory representation of the nation's internal divisions. Ocasio-Cortez represented a vision of a proactive, compassionate government that acts as the primary driver of social progress and economic stability. In contrast, Roy represented a vision of a restrained, limited government that prioritizes individual liberty and the strict adherence to the Constitution above all else. Neither side seemed willing to concede any ground, as each point made was met with an equally fervent and well-reasoned counterpoint. This suggests that the disagreement is not merely over policy details but over the very definition of what it means to be a free and prosperous society. The source material illustrates this moment as a definitive clash between progressive rhetoric and the conservative demand for fiscal and administrative accountability. It portrays a scene where the traditional norms of bipartisan cooperation have been replaced by a more adversarial and ideologically driven form of politics. This shift reflects the broader changes in the American electorate, which has become more sorted into distinct and often hostile ideological camps. The House floor, in this context, becomes a stage where these larger social conflicts are enacted for a national audience through the medium of legislative debate. It is a performance that is both highly choreographed and deeply authentic in its representation of the speaker's core convictions. Ultimately, the debate is framed as a stark contrast between those who advocate for expanded government services and those who view the state as a threat to individual freedom. This binary choice has become the central organizing principle of American politics in the current era, influencing everything from local elections to Supreme Court appointments. The confrontation between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy is a microcosm of this larger struggle, providing a clear and concise look at the arguments that will shape the future of the country. It reminds us that the questions being asked on the House floor are the same ones being asked in coffee shops and boardrooms across the nation. The resolution of this debate will determine the trajectory of the American experiment for the next generation and beyond. The nuances of the language used by both representatives provide further insight into the strategies they employ to persuade their audiences and delegitimize their opponents. Ocasio-Cortez uses the language of inclusion and social justice to frame her arguments as a moral imperative that transcends mere politics. Roy uses the language of liberty and constitutionalism to frame his arguments as a defense of the nation's founding principles against a modern encroachment. Both are masters of their respective rhetorical styles, using every word to maximum effect in the high-stakes environment of a congressional hearing. Their ability to articulate these complex ideas in a way that is accessible to the public is a testament to their skill as political communicators. The focus on the average American's burden highlights the populist undertones that are present in both the progressive and conservative critiques of the status quo. While they disagree on the cause of the problem, both representatives claim to be fighting for the interests of ordinary people against a distant and unresponsive elite. This shared populist impulse suggests that there is a widespread sense of dissatisfaction with the current state of the country, even if there is no agreement on how to fix it. The debate on the House floor is a public airing of these grievances, providing a vent for the frustrations of a divided citizenry. It is an essential part of the democratic process, allowing for the peaceful expression of radical differences in opinion. The concept of government overreach is one that has a long and storied history in American political discourse, dating back to the founding of the Republic. Roy's use of this term taps into a deep reservoir of skepticism towards centralized authority that is a defining feature of the American character. By citing specific examples of federal interference, he seeks to make an abstract principle feel concrete and personal to his audience. This technique is highly effective in mobilizing those who feel that their way of life is under threat from a distant and impersonal state. It transforms a policy debate into a struggle for the soul of the nation and the preservation of its traditional values. Conversely, the progressive defense of the state is rooted in the belief that the government is the only institution capable of addressing the systemic problems of the modern world. Ocasio-Cortez's approach is to highlight the failures of the market and the private sector to provide for the basic needs of the population. She argues that the state has a positive obligation to ensure that every citizen has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and security. This view challenges the traditional American emphasis on individualism and suggests that a more collective approach is necessary in an increasingly interconnected and complex society. It is a vision that is both aspirational and deeply controversial, as it requires a fundamental rethinking of the role of the individual in relation to the community. The mention of excessive spending as a burden on the average American is a powerful rhetorical device that connects the high-level policy debates in Washington to the kitchen table concerns of voters. By framing the national debt as a personal liability for every citizen, Roy is able to make the case for fiscal restraint in a way that is both relatable and urgent. This argument is particularly effective during times of economic uncertainty and inflation, when many families are feeling the pinch of rising costs. It suggests that the government's fiscal decisions have a direct and measurable impact on the quality of life for everyone in the country. This link between macroeconomic policy and personal well-being is a key component of the conservative economic narrative. The portrayal of this moment as a clash between progressive rhetoric and conservative demands for accountability is a useful way to understand the underlying dynamics of the exchange. It highlights the fact that both sides are operating from a different set of assumptions and priorities, making a true consensus almost impossible to achieve. The goal of the debate is not necessarily to convince the other side, but to clarify the choices facing the electorate and to define the terms of the political conversation. In this sense, the confrontation was a success, as it provided a clear and uncompromising look at the two dominant worldviews in American politics today. It set the stage for the many debates that will follow as the nation grapples with these fundamental questions. The intensity of the exchange also serves as a reminder of the high stakes involved in these legislative battles, as the outcomes will have a lasting impact on the lives of millions of people. Every law passed and every regulation enacted is a reflection of the prevailing balance of power and the dominant ideology of the time. The confrontation between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy is a snapshot of this ongoing struggle for influence and control over the direction of the country. It is a reminder that politics is not just a game of numbers and votes, but a clash of ideas and values that shape the world we live in. The passion displayed by both representatives is a reflection of the importance they place on their respective missions and the future of the American Republic. The subsequent phase of this inquiry delves deeper into the intellectual and political foundations of the arguments presented during this high-stakes exchange on the House floor. Chip Roy's rebuttal was not merely a spontaneous emotional reaction, but rather a concentrated distillation of decades of conservative apprehension regarding the unmitigated expansion of the administrative state. He posited that every dollar allocated to a federal program carries with it an invisible tether of regulation that slowly restricts the autonomous movements of the American public. This perspective views the federal government not as a series of disparate agencies providing helpful services, but as a singular, cohesive leviathan whose primary instinct is self-preservation and growth. The representative's argument suggests that the perceived benefits of government intervention are often eclipsed by the long-term erosion of the constitutional safeguards that were designed to prevent the centralization of power in Washington. The discussion surrounding the national debt serves as a critical pillar in this critique, moving beyond mere accounting to address the fundamental morality of modern fiscal policy. Roy argued that the current trajectory of deficit spending is effectively a form of taxation without representation imposed upon future generations of Americans who will inherit the consequences of today's legislative choices. This economic burden is framed as a direct assault on the American dream, as it necessitates higher interest rates, fuels inflation, and diminishes the purchasing power of the average family's hard-earned income. By characterizing debt as a tool of state control, the argument links the abstract figures of the federal budget to the tangible economic struggles faced by constituents in their daily lives. The conservative position holds that true compassion is not found in the distribution of borrowed funds, but in the maintenance of a stable and solvent currency that allows for individual prosperity. As the confrontation progressed, the focus shifted toward the specific mechanisms of what Roy described as government overreach, particularly the role of unelected bureaucrats in the daily lives of citizens. He contended that the proliferation of federal regulations has created a labyrinthine system that is nearly impossible for the average small business owner or private individual to navigate without legal peril. This regulatory thicket is seen as an interference with personal liberties because it replaces individual judgment and local custom with a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach dictated by the capital city. The critique suggests that the modern state has moved far beyond its original mandate of providing common defense and ensuring domestic tranquility, instead involving itself in the minutiae of private enterprise and personal conduct. To those who share this view, the question is not whether the government can do more, but whether it has already done far too much at the expense of human agency. The concept of weaponized bureaucracies was introduced as a more sinister manifestation of this overreach, implying that the neutral mask of the civil service has been discarded in favor of partisan objectives. Roy expressed a deep-seated suspicion that certain federal agencies have been co-opted to target individuals and organizations that express dissent against the prevailing political orthodoxy of the executive branch. This argument taps into a broader national anxiety regarding the transparency and accountability of institutions that possess the power to investigate, audit, and prosecute American citizens. When the state is perceived as a partisan actor rather than an impartial referee, the social contract is fundamentally weakened, leading to a breakdown in public trust and institutional legitimacy. The source material highlights this as a pivotal point of contention, where the debate moves from the efficacy of policy to the very integrity of the democratic process itself. Regarding the issue of border insecurity, the argument was framed as a fundamental failure of the government to perform its most basic obligation, the protection of the nation's territorial integrity. Roy posited that the lack of a cohesive and strictly enforced border policy is not an oversight but a deliberate choice that undermines the rule of law and the safety of the community. This failure is contrasted with the government's perceived eagerness to regulate the activities of law-abiding citizens within the interior of the country. From this perspective, it is a glaring hypocrisy for a state to demand total compliance with its domestic mandates while simultaneously abdicating its duty to secure its own frontiers against unauthorized entry. This specific example of overreach by omission serves to illustrate the conservative grievance that the government's priorities are dangerously misaligned with the actual needs of the American people. The progressive counterargument, as initially framed by Ocasio-Cortez, operates on a fundamentally different set of assumptions regarding the nature of the state and the obligations of society. This viewpoint suggests that the complexities of a modern, globalized economy require a robust and proactive government to ensure that the basic needs of the citizenry are met with dignity. From this perspective, the federal government is the only entity with the scale and resources necessary to tackle systemic issues like climate change, healthcare inequality, and structural poverty. The question of when citizens complain about the state doing too much is intended to highlight the popularity of programs like Social Security and Medicare, which have become integral to the fabric of American life. This ideology views the collective power of the people, expressed through their representative government, as the primary engine for social progress and the protection of the vulnerable against the excesses of the private sector. The tension between these two worldviews is portrayed as a clash between rhetoric that emphasizes social justice and demands for administrative accountability that emphasize the limits of power. Ocasio-Cortez uses her platform to advocate for a vision where the government is an instrument of positive change, constantly expanding its reach to address new and emerging challenges. Conversely, Roy's position is that this constant expansion is the very source of the problems the nation faces, creating a cycle of dependency and institutional failure. The source notes that this debate is not just about the numbers on a balance sheet, but about the competing visions of what constitutes a good life in the American context. Is it a life secured by the guarantees of a benevolent state, or is it a life defined by the risks and rewards of personal liberty and individual responsibility? This fundamental disagreement creates a legislative environment where compromise is increasingly difficult to achieve, as each side views the other's goals as inherently destructive to the nation's future. The House floor thus becomes a theater for the expression of these divergent philosophies, with each representative playing a role that is both deeply personal and intensely symbolic. The language used in these exchanges is carefully calibrated to resonate with specific segments of the electorate, reinforcing existing beliefs and deepening the divide between different ideological camps. For the supporters of the progressive movement, Ocasio-Cortez represents the bold future of a government that finally works for everyone. For those who align with the conservative cause, Roy represents a principled stand against the inevitable tyranny of an unchecked and insolvent central government. The debate also reflects a broader shift in American political discourse toward a more confrontational and less collaborative style of governance. In previous eras, there might have been a search for a middle ground that balanced the need for public services with the requirement for fiscal discipline and individual rights. However, the current climate is one of stark contrasts, where the very legitimacy of the opponent's worldview is often called into question. This dynamic is fueled by a media environment that rewards conflict and by a political system that incentivizes representatives to cater to the most passionate elements of their base. The confrontation between these two representatives is a perfect distillation of this trend, capturing a moment where the two dominant paths for the country's future are presented in their most unvarnished forms. One must also consider the role of institutional memory and the weight of history that each speaker brings to the podium during such a significant exchange. Roy's references to the founding principles and the Constitution are intended to ground his arguments in a timeless tradition that he believes is under immediate threat from modern radicalism. Ocasio-Cortez's focus on current social conditions and the struggles of her constituents is intended to show that those founding principles must evolve to meet the realities of a changing world. This conflict over the meaning of the past is just as important as the conflict over the policies of the present. It suggests that the American identity is not a static thing but a constant negotiation between the ideals of the founders and the aspirations of the current generation. The debate's framing of the state as either a provider of services or a threat to freedom is a binary that simplifies complex realities but clarifies the political choices at hand. In a world of infinite needs and finite resources, the government must inevitably choose which problems to prioritize and which risks to accept. The progressive vision prioritizes the risk of inaction and the suffering of the individual, while the conservative vision prioritizes the risk of state power and the loss of individual autonomy. This confrontation highlights that there is no easy way to reconcile these priorities, as they are rooted in different moral and philosophical starting points. The result is a persistent and often paralyzing tension at the heart of the American political system, which is precisely what the transcript aims to showcase. Furthermore, the focus on the average American by both sides suggests a shared recognition that the center of the country is feeling the pressure of these competing forces. Both representatives claim to be the true defenders of the working class, though their prescriptions for relief are diametrically opposed. This competition for the soul of the common man is a recurring theme in American populism, where the elite are alternately defined as the wealthy corporate class or the distant bureaucratic class. By framing the debate in these terms, both Ocasio-Cortez and Roy are attempting to build a broad coalition that can support their respective visions for the country. This effort to define the people and their interests is one of the most powerful and consequential aspects of their political communication. The intensity of the rhetoric used, words like fiery rebuttal, weaponized, and threat, indicates that the stakes are perceived as existential rather than merely procedural. When the government is described in such terms, it is no longer just a collection of departments but a protagonist or antagonist in a grand national drama. This high-octane language is designed to capture the attention of a distracted public and to signal the gravity of the issues being discussed on the floor. It also reflects the genuine passion of the representatives themselves, who are often true believers in the ideologies they represent. This authenticity, even when it leads to confrontation, is a key part of their appeal to their respective audiences across the United States. In analyzing the source's portrayal of this event, it becomes clear that the clash is being offered as a representative sample of the broader cultural and political war currently underway. The interaction is used to illustrate the point that the two sides are no longer speaking the same language, as their definitions of basic terms like freedom and help have diverged. This linguistic and conceptual gap makes the work of the House of Representatives increasingly difficult, as the common ground necessary for legislation continues to shrink. The transcript serves as a warning that without a shared understanding of the role of government, the nation may find itself in a state of perpetual ideological gridlock. Yet, it also serves as a celebration of the robust and open debate that is a hallmark of a healthy democracy, even when it is uncomfortable. The administrative state, often called the fourth branch of government, remains the primary target of Roy's critique because it operates largely outside the direct control of the electorate. He argues that by delegating legislative authority to these agencies, Congress has abdicated its responsibility and allowed a technocratic elite to rule by fiat. This perspective is a direct challenge to the progressive belief that experts are best positioned to manage the complexities of modern society. The confrontation thus touches on the fundamental question of whether a democracy can survive when the power to make rules is disconnected from the power to win elections. This is a question that goes to the very heart of the American system of checks and balances and the separation of powers. Ultimately, the source frames the debate as a choice between two distinct paths for the American Republic, neither of which is without its own set of challenges and risks. One path leads toward a more integrated and supportive state that aims to provide a high floor for the well-being of all its citizens. The other path leads toward a more decentralized and restricted state that aims to provide a high ceiling for the liberty and achievement of the individual. The exchange between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy does not resolve this choice, but it clarifies the terms of the argument for the American people to consider. It reminds us that the House floor is the place where these competing visions are tested against one another in the light of public scrutiny. As we conclude this portion of the analysis, the focus remains on the specific instances of friction that arise when these two powerful ideologies collide in a formal legislative setting. The tension is palpable not just in the words spoken, but in the underlying assumptions about what makes a society just and prosperous. The source material provides a clear-eyed look at this reality, presenting the arguments of both sides without the usual partisan filters that often distort the truth. It allows the reader to see the debate as a meaningful and necessary part of the ongoing American experiment, rather than just a moment of political theater. The next section will continue this exploration, looking at the long-term implications of these arguments for the future of federal policy and the State of the Union. The third phase of this comprehensive analysis explores the intricate and often volatile accusations regarding the weaponization of federal agencies and the perceived collapse of border security. Within the halls of Congress, these topics are not merely policy disagreements but are treated as existential threats to the very framework of the American Republic. Representative Chip Roy's assertions regarding weaponized bureaucracies reflect a growing conviction among many that the neutral enforcement of the law has been compromised by ideological bias. He argued that the immense power of the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service is being deployed as a tactical weapon to suppress political opposition. This perspective views the modern administrative state as having transformed from a servant of the public into a self-protecting entity that punishes those who challenge its authority. The concern regarding the politicization of the civil service is rooted in the belief that the deep state operates with a level of autonomy that defies traditional oversight. This argument suggests that the professional bureaucracy has developed its own set of interests which may not align with the constitutional duties they were sworn to uphold. When federal agents are perceived to be targeting parents at school board meetings or religious organizations, the resulting friction creates a profound crisis of legitimacy. Roy contended that such actions are the inevitable byproduct of a government that has grown so large it can no longer be effectively managed by the people's elected representatives. This narrative posits that the expansion of the state's reach into the private lives of Americans is a direct precursor to the erosion of fundamental civil liberties. In contrast, the progressive response to these allegations often frames the work of federal agencies as essential to the maintenance of a modern and equitable society. From this viewpoint, the oversight provided by these institutions is the only thing standing between the public and the unchecked influence of corporate and elite interests. They argue that the term weaponization is a rhetorical strategy designed to undermine the legal processes that hold powerful actors accountable for their actions. This perspective asserts that a robust civil service is necessary to enforce environmental protections, civil rights, and the fair collection of revenue required to fund public services. The debate thus shifts from the behavior of individual bureaucrats to the broader question of whether the administrative state is a protector of or a predator upon the American people. The focus on border insecurity serves as a primary example of what the conservative side describes as the government's most egregious failure of core responsibility. Representative Roy and his colleagues argued that a nation without a secure and defined boundary ceases to function as a sovereign entity in any meaningful sense. They contended that the federal government's inability or unwillingness to enforce existing immigration laws has led to a humanitarian and security crisis of unprecedented proportions. This failure is viewed not as a lack of resources, but as a deliberate policy choice that compromises the safety of communities across the United States. To the conservative mind, the state's preoccupation with regulating domestic affairs while ignoring its own borders is a betrayal of the fundamental social contract. The discourse surrounding the border also highlights the deep divide regarding the humanitarian obligations of a global power in the 21st century. Progressives like Ocasio-Cortez often emphasize the need for a system that recognizes the inherent dignity of individuals seeking a better life or fleeing violence. They argue that the focus on enforcement and walls ignores the systemic causes of migration and fails to address the complexities of the modern asylum system. This view suggests that the government should prioritize the provision of social and legal services to those at the border rather than relying solely on punitive measures. The conflict here is between a vision of the nation as a fortress protecting its resources and a vision of the nation as a refuge extending its values. This specific clash of perspectives illustrates why the two sides are often unable to reach a common ground on even the most basic legislative matters. For one side, the border is a line that must be held at all costs to preserve the rule of law and the stability of the economy. For the other side, the border is a side of human struggle that requires a compassionate and multifaceted policy response that goes beyond mere policing. These views are rooted in different interpretations of what it means to be a responsible government in a world where people are increasingly mobile. The resulting impasse on the House floor reflects the broader national inability to reconcile the demands of security with the calls for humanitarianism. Furthermore, the discussion on weaponized bureaucracies often returns to the theme of administrative accountability and the role of the individual. Representative Roy suggested that the average American is increasingly caught in a net of regulations that are created and enforced by people they never voted for. This lack of democratic accountability is seen as a fundamental flaw in the way the modern United States government operates on a day-to-day basis. It creates a sense of alienation among the populace, who feel that their voices are drowned out by the noise of the Washington machine. The conservative demand for accountability is therefore a call to return power to the people and their direct representatives in the legislative branch. The progressive defense of the administrative state relies on the idea that professional expertise is a vital component of good governance. They argue that the complexities of modern life, from managing the economy to protecting the public health, require a level of specialized knowledge that only a professional civil service can provide. In this view, the accountability demanded by conservatives is often seen as a way to dismantle the government's ability to act on behalf of the public good. This perspective holds that the state must be empowered to solve large-scale problems that individuals and private organizations are unable to address on their own. The tension between the need for expertise and the requirement for democratic control remains one of the most difficult challenges for the American system. As the debate on the House floor intensified, the language used by both representatives became more sharply focused on the consequences of these opposing philosophies. The mention of national debt was tied directly to the expansion of the bureaucracy, suggesting that the government's growth is not just a threat to liberty but also to economic survival. Roy argued that the administrative state is a primary driver of the spending that is currently pushing the nation toward a fiscal reckoning. This economic critique provides a practical foundation for the more abstract concerns about federal overreach and the loss of individual freedom. It frames the struggle as a choice between a sustainable, limited government and an insolvent, all-encompassing state. The progressive counterpoint emphasizes that the real threat to the average American comes from the lack of government services and the resulting economic precarity. They argue that the burden of government spending is a necessary investment in the future of the country and the well-being of its citizens. From this perspective, the real danger is not the national debt, but the growing gap between the wealthy and the rest of society that the government is failing to bridge. This worldview suggests that the state should be used more aggressively to redistribute resources and ensure that everyone has access to basic needs like healthcare and housing. The debate thus becomes a fundamental disagreement over the primary purpose of the national economy and the state's role in managing it. The concept of a weaponized bureaucracy is particularly potent because it taps into deep-seated American fears of centralized authority and government corruption. It evokes images of a state that uses its power to pick winners and losers based on political loyalty rather than objective merit. Roy's use of this terminology is a deliberate attempt to frame the debate as a battle for the integrity of the nation's institutions. It suggests that the problem is not just policy, but a systemic rot that must be excised through radical reform and a return to constitutional basics. This narrative is highly effective in mobilizing a base of voters who feel that the system is fundamentally rigged against them. On the other hand, the progressive focus on the positive role of the government aims to rebuild public trust in the institutions of the state. By highlighting the tangible benefits of public programs, Ocasio-Cortez seeks to show that the government is an essential partner in the success of every citizen. She argues that the skepticism toward federal agencies is often fueled by those who want to see the public sector fail so that private interests can take its place. This perspective views the administrative state as a necessary check on the power of the market, ensuring that the needs of the many are not sacrificed for the profits of the few. The battle is thus for the hearts and minds of an American public that is increasingly skeptical of all institutional authority. The discussion also touched upon the way in which the media and the political establishment influence the public's perception of these issues. Both representatives are acutely aware that their words on the House floor are being broadcast to a national audience through various platforms. They use their time at the podium to craft narratives that will resonate with their respective supporters and frame the actions of their opponents in the worst possible light. This high-stakes communication strategy is a key part of modern politics, where the goal is often to define the terms of the debate before it even begins. The confrontation on the floor is just the most visible part of a much larger and more complex struggle for narrative dominance. The intensity of the exchange between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy also reflects the personal convictions and the political stakes for each individual. For the Congresswoman, the expansion of government services is a moral imperative that she has championed since she first entered the public eye. For the Congressman, the reduction of federal power and the preservation of fiscal sanity is a lifelong mission that he views as his primary duty to his constituents. These deeply held beliefs ensure that their interactions will always be characterized by a high degree of passion and ideological consistency. Neither is likely to back down from their core principles, making the House of Representatives a perennial site of conflict and debate. As the third part of this analysis comes to a close, it is clear that the issues of weaponized bureaucracy and border insecurity are central to the current American political crisis. They represent the most significant points of friction between a progressive vision of a proactive state and a conservative vision of a restrained government. The confrontation between these two representatives is a clear and powerful demonstration of the deep divisions that exist within the country today. It reminds us that the questions being debated in Washington are not just academic, but have real-world consequences for every citizen. The outcome of these struggles will define the nature of American democracy for the foreseeable future. The debate over the administrative state is ultimately a debate over the source of authority in a free society. Does that authority reside in the hands of the people and their elected representatives, or has it shifted to an unelected class of experts and bureaucrats? This is the fundamental question that underlies the arguments made by both Ocasio-Cortez and Roy during their exchange on the House floor. The answer to this question will determine the direction of the country and the extent of the freedoms enjoyed by its citizens. The next installment will examine the specific fiscal arguments and the long-term implications of the national debt in more detail. The fourth installment of this analytical narrative focuses on the economic underpinnings and the fiscal volatility that define the confrontation between Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Chip Roy. Within the high-pressure environment of the House floor, the discussion of the national debt evolved from a mere statistical disagreement into a profound debate over the survival of the American financial system. Chip Roy's contribution to this dialogue was centered on the urgent warning that the United States is rapidly approaching a point of no return regarding its fiscal obligations. He argued that the current deficit spending is not an abstract policy choice but a direct assault on the economic security of future generations of Americans. This perspective characterizes the accumulation of red ink in Washington as a form of institutional negligence that threatens to destabilize the global standing of the United States dollar. The specific figures mentioned during the exchange, including a national debt that has surged past the $38 trillion mark, served as a stark backdrop to the ideological warfare. Roy posited that the interest payments alone on this debt now exceed the entire budgets of several major federal departments, including Medicaid and national defense. To him, this mathematical reality represents a financial reckoning that is no longer a distant possibility but an imminent certainty for the country. He suggested that every dollar spent by the federal government today is essentially borrowed from the prosperity of tomorrow, creating a cycle of dependency and devaluation. This economic critique is inextricably linked to his broader vision of a restrained government that operates within its means and respects the autonomy of the individual. Representative Ocasio-Cortez countered this narrative by reframing the concept of government spending as a necessary and vital investment in the nation's human capital. She argued that the cost of government is often measured incorrectly, focusing on the outlays while ignoring the massive social and economic dividends of a healthy and educated workforce. From her perspective, the true economic threat is not the national debt but the systemic underfunding of essential services that protect the most vulnerable citizens. She pointed to programs like the Affordable Care Act and food assistance as essential components of a stable economy that allows for social mobility. By focusing on the immediate needs of her constituents, she challenged the idea that fiscal restraint should ever take precedence over the basic well-being of the American people. The clash also delved into the specific ways in which federal spending is perceived to benefit or burden the average citizen in their daily lives. Roy contended that the inflation tax resulting from excessive government spending is the most regressive and damaging form of taxation currently facing the American public. He argued that as the government prints and spends more money, the purchasing power of the middle class is systematically eroded, leading to higher prices for groceries, fuel, and housing. This view suggests that the administrative state, in its quest to provide more services, is actually making life more difficult and expensive for those it claims to help. The debate thus becomes a question of whether the state is a source of economic support or the primary driver of economic instability. Ocasio-Cortez offered a sharp critique of the Republican approach to fiscal accountability, suggesting that it often serves to enrich the powerful at the expense of the poor. She denounced legislative efforts that seek to cut social programs while simultaneously providing massive tax breaks to corporations and the wealthiest individuals in the country. To her, the fiscal sanity preached by her opponents is a rhetorical smokescreen for the redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top of the social ladder. She argued that the government has a moral and economic obligation to use its resources to bridge the growing gap between the elite and the working class. This perspective rejects the traditional conservative focus on balanced budgets in favor of a more dynamic and equitable approach to national resource management. The recurring battles over the debt ceiling were cited as a primary example of the legislative gridlock that prevents meaningful progress on the nation's economic challenges. Roy characterized these episodes as a necessary, albeit painful, mechanism for forcing the government to confront its unsustainable spending habits and administrative bloat. He argued that without the pressure of these deadlines, the political establishment would continue to kick the can down the road indefinitely, avoiding the hard choices required for long-term stability. Conversely, the progressive side views these fiscal standoffs as a form of political hostage-taking that threatens the creditworthiness of the United States and the stability of the global economy. This fundamental disagreement over the tactics of governance reflects the deep-seated mistrust that now defines the relationship between the two parties in Washington. The discussion also touched upon the generational implications of the national debt, with Roy framing it as a betrayal of the nation's youth. He argued that the current generation of leaders is effectively living on the credit card of their children and grandchildren, leaving them with a legacy of debt and diminished opportunity. This moral argument adds a layer of urgency to the fiscal debate, suggesting that the choices made today will determine the quality of life for Americans 50 years from now. It frames the struggle for fiscal accountability as a battle for the survival of the American dream itself, rather than just a technical policy dispute. To those who share this view, the preservation of the nation's financial integrity is the highest form of patriotism and a sacred duty of leadership. The progressive response emphasizes that the failure to invest in the present is what truly threatens the future of the next generation. Ocasio-Cortez argued that a country with crumbling infrastructure, an inaccessible healthcare system, and a mounting climate crisis is a much greater burden than a high level of national debt. She suggests that the focus on debt serves as a distraction from the real-world problems that will define the lives of young people if they are not addressed today. From this viewpoint, the government must be bold and proactive in its spending to ensure that the future is both sustainable and equitable. The debate is thus a choice between two different types of generational responsibility, one focused on fiscal balance and the other on social and environmental investment. As the exchange continued, the administrative state's role in managing these massive expenditures became a focal point of intense scrutiny and disagreement. Roy argued that the bureaucracy has become a self-sustaining machine that prioritizes its own growth over the efficient and transparent use of taxpayer funds. He pointed to instances of government waste and redundancy as evidence that the system is no longer capable of policing itself or being held accountable by the public. This critique suggests that the problem is not just how much the government spends, but how poorly it manages the resources it already has at its disposal. To him, administrative accountability is the first and most necessary step toward restoring the public's trust in the national government and its fiscal decisions. Ocasio-Cortez defended the civil service as a collection of dedicated professionals who perform the essential work of keeping the country running in an increasingly complex world. She argued that the attacks on the bureaucracy, often a way to undermine the very regulations that protect the public from corporate greed and environmental destruction. From her perspective, the call for accountability is frequently a code for the deregulation of industry and the privatization of the public good. She believes that a robust and well-funded government is the only force capable of ensuring that the economy works for everyone, not just those at the top. The clash between these two representatives illustrates the polarized nature of the American debate over the size, scope, and cost of the state. The intensity of the rhetoric used in this economic discussion reflects the high stakes involved for both the representatives and their respective constituencies. Words like reckoning, betrayal, and robbing are not used lightly. They are designed to signal the gravity of the fiscal path the country is currently traversing. Every point made on the House floor is intended to resonate with an American public that is deeply concerned about its own financial future and the stability of the nation. The confrontation between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy provides a clear and uncompromising look at the two dominant economic philosophies currently competing for dominance in Washington. It serves as a reminder that the decisions made in the halls of Congress have a direct and measurable impact on the lives of every citizen. Ultimately, the source frames this economic debate as a stark choice between a future of managed decline through excessive spending or a future of renewed prosperity through fiscal restraint and individual liberty. It captures a moment where the traditional consensus on the role of government in the economy has completely broken down, replaced by a more adversarial and ideologically pure form of politics. The exchange highlights the fact that neither side is willing to compromise on their core principles, as they view the other's vision as a fundamental threat to the American way of life. This suggests that the struggle over the national debt and fiscal accountability will remain a central feature of the American political landscape for the foreseeable future. The House floor remains the primary site where these competing visions are tested and presented to the public for their consideration. As we conclude the fourth part of this analysis, it is clear that the economic arguments presented by both sides are deeply rooted in their respective moral and philosophical frameworks. The debate over the national debt is not just about numbers. It is about the values that define the country and the direction in which it is heading. The confrontation between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy serves as a powerful illustration of this reality, providing a clear-eyed look at the stakes of the current political crisis. The next and final installment will bring together all these themes to examine the ultimate framing of the clash between progressive services and individual freedom. It will look at the long-term implications of this debate for the future of the American experiment and the preservation of its core ideals. The final movement of this comprehensive analysis brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the ideological war waged between Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Chip Roy. At its most fundamental level, the exchange on the House floor serves as a definitive testament to the diverging paths available to the American Republic in the current century. One path is paved with the promises of a robust and proactive federal government that seeks to eliminate the systemic insecurities of modern life through collective action. The other path is defined by a rigorous adherence to the principles of limited government, fiscal discipline, and the preservation of individual liberty against state encroachment. This confrontation is not merely a debate over policy details but a high-stakes struggle for the very soul and identity of the nation itself. The philosophical divide between these two figures represents a fundamental disagreement on the definition of human flourishing and the state's role in facilitating it. For the progressive movement, as articulated by Ocasio-Cortez, the government is the primary vehicle through which a society expresses its compassion and ensures a basic standard of dignity for all. This vision suggests that true freedom is impossible in a world where individuals are shackled by the fear of medical bankruptcy or the weight of crushing student debt. From this vantage point, the expansion of the administrative state is not a threat to liberty but a necessary expansion of the social contract to meet modern demands. The critique of overreach is therefore viewed as a rhetorical attempt to maintain a status quo that benefits only the wealthy and the powerful. Conversely, the conservative perspective championed by Roy views the state not as a savior but as a potential predator that must be constantly restrained by constitutional barriers. This worldview holds that the most significant threat to individual freedom is the concentration of power in a centralized and often unaccountable federal apparatus. Every new service provided by the government is seen as another link in a chain that slowly but surely erodes the capacity for self-reliance and community autonomy. To those who share this belief, the benevolence of the state is a dangerous illusion that masks the inevitable reality of bureaucratic control and fiscal insolvency. The struggle on the House floor is thus framed as a desperate defense of the individual against the encroaching shadow of a managerial leviathan. This clash of visions has created a political environment where the middle ground is increasingly seen as a landscape of compromise and intellectual cowardice. The representatives are not just speaking to each other, they are communicating to a deeply divided electorate that demands clarity, conviction, and a refusal to yield on core principles. This sorting of the American public into distinct ideological camps has transformed the legislative process into a series of high-definition battles where every word is a weapon. The confrontation between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy is a perfect example of this new reality, where the primary goal is to define the opponent as an existential threat. As a result, the capacity for bipartisan cooperation has been replaced by a state of perpetual political mobilization and cultural warfare. The long-term implications of this ideological gridlock are profound and touch upon the very stability of the American experiment in self-governance. If the nation cannot agree on the basic purpose of its government, the institutions designed to channel conflict into resolution will eventually begin to fracture under the pressure. The debate over the national debt, the security of the border, and the neutrality of the civil service are all symptoms of a deeper crisis of national identity. Without a shared understanding of the social contract, the mechanisms of the state become tools for whoever happens to hold power at any given moment. This leads to a cycle of institutional weaponization that further erodes public trust and increases the volatility of the political system. The concept of freedom itself has become a contested territory, with both sides claiming the moral high ground in their interpretation of the term. To the progressive, freedom is the presence of opportunity and the absence of want, which requires a proactive state to level the playing field for all. To the conservative, freedom is the absence of coercion and the presence of individual agency, which requires a strictly limited government that stays out of the way. These two definitions are fundamentally incompatible in practice, leading to a zero-sum game where every legislative victory for one side is seen as a catastrophic loss for the other. This dynamic ensures that the House floor will remain a site of intense and often bitter conflict for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, the role of the representative has evolved from a local delegate into a national surrogate for a specific ideological brand. Both Ocasio-Cortez and Roy have built national platforms that transcend their specific districts, allowing them to exert influence far beyond the walls of the Capitol. This nationalization of politics means that local concerns are often overshadowed by the larger cultural and economic struggles that define the national conversation. It also increases the pressure on representatives to maintain ideological purity, as any deviation from the base's expectations can lead to a primary challenge from the more radical wings of their parties. The confrontation on the floor is therefore as much a performance for the national base as it is a serious policy debate. The source material highlights that the stark contrast presented in this debate is not an exaggeration but a precise reflection of the current American condition. The tension between the demand for expanded services and the fear of state overreach is the defining friction of the modern administrative era. As the government continues to grow in both size and scope, the questions raised by Roy regarding accountability and liberty become increasingly urgent and difficult to answer. Simultaneously, as the global economy creates new forms of inequality and precarity, the demands voiced by Ocasio-Cortez for a more supportive state will only grow louder and more persistent. The resolution of this tension will likely require a fundamental reimagining of the American system that has not yet begun to take shape. One of the most striking aspects of the exchange was the degree to which both sides utilized the language of populist resentment to frame their arguments. While the targets of their ire were different, corporate elites versus bureaucratic elites, the underlying energy was the same, a sense that the system is no longer working for the average American. This shared populism suggests that the center of the country is in a state of profound unrest, feeling squeezed between a distant government and an impersonal global market. The representatives on the House floor are giving voice to this frustration, even if they propose diametrically opposed solutions to the problem. This populist impulse is a powerful and unpredictable force that will continue to shape the trajectory of American politics for years to come. The administrative state, often criticized by Roy as a weaponized and unaccountable entity, remains the primary battlefield for these competing visions of power. The struggle to control the bureaucracy is essentially a struggle to control the levers of modern governance without the need for constant legislative approval. For progressives, the civil service is the key to implementing a long-term vision of social engineering and economic reform that can survive changes in the executive branch. For conservatives, the civil service is a deep state that must be dismantled or purged to restore the primacy of the elected representatives and the Constitution. This battle for institutional control is perhaps the most consequential aspect of the modern political conflict, as it determines the actual mechanics of how power is exercised. The debate also serves as a reminder that the American Republic was designed to be a system of conflict and tension, rather than one of easy consensus. The founders anticipated that different interests and ideologies would clash within the halls of government, and they built a system of checks and balances to prevent any one faction from becoming too powerful. However, the current level of polarization may be testing the limits of these constitutional safeguards in ways the founders never imagined. When the two sides no longer share a common set of facts or a mutual respect for the legitimacy of the opposition, the system of checks and balances can easily turn into a system of total paralysis. The confrontation on the House floor is a visible sign of this potential institutional failure and a call for a renewed commitment to the democratic process. As we look toward the future, the questions raised by this exchange will continue to dominate the national discourse and influence the outcome of every major election. Will the United States choose to embrace a more European-style social democracy with an expanded safety net and a higher tax burden? Or will it double down on its traditional emphasis on individualism, free markets, and the strict limitation of federal power? There is no easy answer to these questions, as both paths carry significant risks and potential rewards for the American people. The role of the House of Representatives is to provide a forum where these choices can be debated openly and vigorously, allowing the public to decide which path they wish to follow. The intensity of the rhetoric between Ocasio-Cortez and Roy is also a reflection of the deep-seated cultural differences that now separate different regions of the country. Their exchange was not just about economics or law. It was about the values, traditions, and worldviews that define life in the Bronx versus life in the Texas Hill Country. This cultural divide is often more difficult to bridge than any policy disagreement, as it involves the core identities of the people being represented. When the government is seen as taking sides in a cultural war, its actions are inevitably viewed as a form of aggression by those on the losing side. This perception of the state as a partisan actor is perhaps the most dangerous development in modern American politics. Ultimately, the source frames the confrontation as a moment of clarity in a time of great national confusion and uncertainty. By stripping away the polite fictions of political cooperation, the representatives have forced the country to look at the raw reality of its internal divisions. This is a necessary step if there is to be any hope of finding a way forward that preserves the unity and the prosperity of the nation. Whether one agrees with Ocasio-Cortez or Roy, one must acknowledge that they are both articulating deeply held convictions that are shared by millions of their fellow citizens. Their clash is the sound of a democracy wrestling with its most fundamental questions in the light of day. In concluding this five-part analysis, we are left with a portrait of a nation at a critical crossroads, facing a choice between two profoundly different futures. The House floor remains the primary theatre for this drama, where the arguments are made and the votes are taken that will shape the world for generations to come. The confrontation between Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Chip Roy is a microcosm of this larger struggle, capturing all the passion, the intellect, and the volatility of the American spirit. It is a reminder that the work of democracy is never finished, and that the preservation of freedom requires a constant and vigilant engagement with the ideas that define us. The struggle continues, and the stakes could not be higher for the future of the American experiment. The administrative state will likely remain the focal point of these tensions as the nation grapples with the limits of its resources and the scope of its ambitions. Every regulation passed and every dollar spent will be scrutinized through the lens of this ideological divide, ensuring that the conflict remains at the center of the political stage. The legacy of this moment will be determined by how the American people respond to the challenges and the opportunities presented by these competing visions of the state. In the end, the power to decide the direction of the country remains where it has always been, in the hands of the citizens who send these representatives to Washington. This is the ultimate lesson of the confrontation on the House floor and the primary hope for the future of the Republic.